So with the United States of America stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, there was no land left to expand into. But there was another region. The Russians had their colony of Alaska, and they were actually worried about losing the distant region without getting something for it, especially from the British, whom they had fought in the Crimean War. So the Russians thought of selling it, but the British were not really interested in buying. When the same offer was asked to our country, there was a huge debate in Congress whether the money would be worth spending in buying Alaska, and the fact that some thought that, well, Alaska was basically a godforsaken piece of ice near the Arctic, not worth owning at all. But there were some fears of being dominated by the British, with all land north of our nation being British controlled. So, in the end, we bought it. With a huge outrage throughout our government, people were shouting that we just wasted money, and we did not know what to do with Alaska now. We left the territory as it was for almost 100 years, because no one really knew what to do with it. But our country was made bigger as a result, and as any good empire or influencing nation loves to be, is big. With Canada cornered by the United States from the south and west, there was a time that we hoped that this indirect pressure on Britain would force them to secede Canada to us, but they did not accept that, and Canada remained on its own. In the late 1800s, our nation would go to war with Spain. This was called the Spanish-American War. One reason why we went to war with Spain was over Cuba. Our nation had been interested in acquiring Cuba from Spain since roughly 1812, when Florida was ceded by Spain to the United States. The Spanish had been treating the Cubans badly for a very long time by this point, and there was an idea to free Cuba from Spanish control and naturally place the island under American administration. Spain would be defeated and forced to relinquish control over the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Caroline and Mariana Islands. By this time, our nation was a rather large one, Greater America, the Grand Old Union. But there was some who would call the seizing of these lands as undemocratic, and much like how an empire would feel after acquiring new territory. To counter this, we all decided to think that planting the American flag on foreign soil was a good thing, doing it all for the native people's sake. This is a way of thought that we still like to have in mind, even to this day when we do this sort of thing. These lands would not exactly become obedient servants of our nation, which resulted in one case of the Filipino American War, sometimes called the Philippine Insurrection, where our armed forces fought against Filipinos against American annexation. This conflict would basically last for 2 years, from 1899 through 1902. In the end, the rebellion was crushed, and the Philippines became a firm American possession. Originally, the United States wanted to keep control of the Philippines as a territory or even possibly as a state, but a deal would be struck up where the country would gain its independence. The deal would make the Philippines gain its independence by 1945. As for Cuba, they also wanted their independence, and we agreed to those terms. Another fact that we often do is that if a nation or people does not accept our way of life or beliefs, we turn a blind eye to their troubles. When the Philippines gained its independence, the country would soon fall into civil conflict and become one of the poorest regions in Southeast Asia. Cuba had a somewhat more stable government, but it later collapsed to communism, and the United States of America would close its borders with the nation and pretend that it does not exist. As for Guam, it's still an American territory, mostly because it's too small or weak to function on its own. Puerto Rico is a very interesting situation. Some call the relationship between America and Puerto Rico as that of being a colony and colonizer. As for the people of the island, most want to keep the relationship the way it is. It's not surprising. To be honest, that island is the most stable in the Caribbean, due to being under the protection of the United States of America. But there are some who want independence, but that is considered a fringe movement at best. When it comes to American interests, we often have no real problems with annexing regions that are strategically valuable. In this case, Hawaii best fits this notion. Hawaii was actually its own country for hundreds of years before American annexation in the late 1800s. At first, it was just trade, due to the location between the Hawaiian Islands and the west coast of the United States. But we would soon begin to look at the island as a strategic location to possibly export American influence into the Pacific. In March of 1897, William McKinley succeeded Grover Cleveland as president. He agreed to a treaty of annexation, but it failed in the Senate with the submission of the Coué petitions, a joint resolution written by Congressman Francis G. Newlands to annex Hawaii. McKinley signed the Newlands resolution, which provided for the official annexation of Hawaii on July 7, 1898, and the islands officially became the Hawaiian Territory, a United States possession, on February 22, 1900. The territorial legislature convened for the first time on February 20, 1901. The overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii and the subsequent annexation of Hawaii has recently been cited as the first major instance of American imperialism. Until annexation in 1898, Hawaii was an independent sovereign state recognized by the United States, United Kingdom, France, Japan, and Germany with the exchange of ambassadors. At this point, the United States of America was at its largest, controlling multiple regions of land in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and Caribbean. Confronted with the idea that we really were an empire in some ways, caused us to rethink some things, as the USA would relinquish control of some of these lands. This is a very classical view of empire, but since we're on the topic, let us view the notion from other viewpoints. Another view is that America's version of a colony is a military base. In this view, it is interesting to note that certain historians of the British Empire have emphasized that prior to 1850, official government policy was generally in favor of acquiring military, especially naval, bases overseas, but opposed to the government-backed acquisition of new colonial territories. It is seldom doubted, however, that British policy pre-1850 was nevertheless essentially imperialistic in nature. While territories such as Guam, the United States Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico remain under U.S. control, the U.S. has allowed many of its overseas territories or occupations to gain independence after World War II. The Philippines in 1946, the Federated States of Micronesia in 1986, the Marshall Islands in 1986, and Palau in 1994 are examples. However, most of these former possessions continue to have U.S. bases within their borders. In the case of Okinawa, which came under U.S. administration after the Battle of Okinawa during World War II, this happened despite local popular opinion. As of 2003, the United States has bases in over 36 countries worldwide. One view, which was rather popular post-World War II, was the notion of benevolent imperialism, the idea that acting like an empire was a good thing, and some people openly said that. With the European colonial powers dismantling their empires or their empires falling apart, there was a power and influence void, and the United States filled that gap. With this in mind, we can argue that the United States went to war with Spain to liberate Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos from their tyrannical European master. If U.S. troops lingered too long in the Philippines, it was to protect the Filipinos from European powers waiting for the American forces to withdraw and to tutor them in American-style democracy. In today's age, we've all heard critics saying the word imperialism to describe United States policy, not only in the early 20th century, but since at least 1803. This marks a difference in the terminology rather than a difference of fundamental historical interpretation from observers who deny that the U.S. has ever been an empire, as some left-wing politicians still argue that U.S. foreign policy has been consistently benevolent.